Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill, a retired biofuels journalist, still writing about ethanol and other biofuels for Ethanol Producer magazine and others. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded before they're lost. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer magazine for producing this podcast. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast or give some feedback, contact us at HomegrownFuels, all one word, at bbiinternational.com. We have two guests today who've actually have written a book called Ethanol, A Hemispheric History for the Future of Biofuels. Jeff Manuel and Tom Rogers are history professors who've collaborated on a book about ethanol in Brazil and the U.S. Jeff, Tom, welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast. But first, introduce yourselves and tell us where you teach.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Sue, for having us on the podcast. We're excited to be here. I'm Tom Rogers. I'm a professor of history at Emory University in Atlanta, and I am the Brazilianist among the two of us. Although over the course of researching and writing this book, I have, of course, learned a great deal about ethanol in the United States as well.
And I'm Jeff Manuel. I'm a professor in the history department at Southern Illinois University-Edwardsville. I came to this project with more of an expertise in U.S. history, but conversely to what Tom said, a lot of it for me was learning a great deal about the absolutely fascinating history of Brazilian biofuels and Brazilian agriculture. And I echo Tom in saying thanks for having us on, Sue. I've been listening to this podcast since it first came out. So, long time caller, first time listener, as they say.
Great. Well, tell me, what was the genesis? Why did you write the book?
Well, we stumbled upon the fact, courtesy of a mutual friend, that we were really researching a similar story in parallel, that I was looking at the history of agricultural modernization in Brazil. My specialty had been, for my first book, about sugarcane agriculture, and I was interested in kind of pushing the timeline up. I was particularly interested in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Brazil's big 1970s ethanol program became the vehicle for telling that story. And at the same time, Jeff was delving into the history of ethanol in the United States. So this friend who Jeff had gone to graduate school with and is my colleague in my department here pointed this fact out to the two of us. And he was here, Jeff was doing research at the Carter Library here in Atlanta, and we got together for lunch and started talking, and that was the beginning of a realization that not only were we studying parallel histories, we were actually studying the same history. Just to say, there were so many connections, direct connections between individuals, between people studying policies across the national boundary, that we realized that, in fact, it really was the same history, and we ought to write it together.
Interesting. So, and it just came out in October, I understand.
Yeah, that's right. The book was just published in October 2025 by the University of Oklahoma Press. Available in all the places online where you might buy books.
Yeah, and to repeat the name of it, it's called Ethanol, A Hemispheric History for the Future of Biofuels. I'm going to be asking you what that for the future is about, but let's get going on. Reading the blurbs about the book, it says this, often we talk, as you said, about the two industries or the two nations being parallel, but there's a lot of connections and they go back a century. Tell me more.
Yeah, as Tom laid out, when we started comparing notes of the independent projects we were working on, Tom mapping the story in Brazil, me beginning to map it in the United States, we realized that there were a lot of really unusual connections, and I think little discussed connections in those two histories. And they start very early. So once we kind of started putting our notes together and charting them back and forth with one another, we realized that this was a story of connections and back and forth collaboration between the United States and Brazil that stretched back really to the dawn of the automobile age, with even a kind of a precursor to that in the 19th century when alcohol fuels like petroleum were used as an illumination fuel. That's the beginning of the story. And then alcohol fuels were there all along throughout the entire 20th century, offering in some ways we think of them almost as like a shadow history of petroleum as a fuel for automobiles. And at certain moments, it stepped to the forefront during moments of crisis in the petroleum system. And then at other moments, it sort of took a back seat when it was much less talked about and less dominant.
Interesting. Okay. So many of the people I've talked to start talking about the ethanol industry's birth in the 1970s, late 70s with the energy crisis. So was this going on in both countries? And talk about, some of your favorite stories from that era.
Sure. We found all of these documents from very early agricultural conferences in Brazil, right at the turn of the 20th century, for instance, of sugarcane producers worried about all of the competition that they faced from bigger global producers like Cuba, for instance, and the fact that they couldn't keep up on price, and so they suffered from overproduction and a kind of chronic crisis. And so some among the sugarcane producers meeting in 1902, 1903, 1905 at these big national conferences said, what we really need is a co-product. We need something else that we can do with all this sugarcane to sell. And so there was a significant lobby for building an ethanol industry even then. And in fact, they did do it. They built out distilleries, they produced ethanol. And as Jeff said, it remained in the shadow of, it is a kind of shadow history of, and it remained in the shadow of petroleum. Not decisively at that early stage, though. It was an open question in both of those countries and other countries around the world about what would end up fueling automobiles. And there were plenty of automobiles driving around on ethanol in those early decades of automobility.
True. Infamously, the Model T could run on alcohol. And there was a big power alcohol movement back then. And I understand that Henry Ford was one that thought corn ethanol might just help with the farm problem back in the 1910s, 1920s, until Prohibition changed the tune, made everybody change their tune.
Yeah, we go into a lot of detail in that in the book. So if people are interested in those stories, we've got quite a few of them. And I'll share just a few of my favorites. Really, I think one of the things I found really interesting that in the studies is that ethanol has always suffered from a history of some folks involved in the industry, not most by any means, but a few folks involved in the industry engaged in fraud. So, for example, very early on, when people were debating whether or not ethanol could compete with gasoline for fueling early automobiles, someone would come out of the woodwork and say, I've got a magical process to produce fuel grade alcohol at lower than the cost of gasoline. And, the newspapers would pick it up and run stories and say, this is going to revolutionize everything. And it turns out they just had, a demonstration kit with high test alcohol being piped in secretly in the background and things like that. Henry Ford himself actually fell for one of these scam artists. A man came to his laboratories in Michigan and said, I've got a way to turn agricultural crops into fuel very, very cheaply. And Ford set him up with a small laboratory and things like that. And it lasted a few months before some of Ford's underlings realized the guy was just scamming them, and he got kicked out. But that has been a sort of an issue that's dogged I think all liquid fuels, honestly. It's not just alcohol fuels. Petroleum certainly has had more than its share of scam artists as well, but these things are pretty persistent.
Interesting.
If you push the timeline forward just a little bit into the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, Brazil, like the United States, did in fact have little regional markets for alcohol production and as a fuel. We love the names that these things got marketed under. One of my favorites is USGA, 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 which is actually an acronym, although it was said in that, you pronounced it. And there was an acronym that stood for the Serra Grande Distillery, which is one of the big producers of sugar in the little state of Alagoas in the northeast of Brazil. But there were many others. There were ones called NOG, Asulina, all kinds of things. And many of these producers marketed it as something called the national fuel or the combustível nacional, with the argument that, it's a patriotic act to buy this homegrown fuel.
It became a patriotic thing in the U.S. And yep. With the term gasohol, that was quite the movement.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about gasohol. As many of your previous guests on the podcast have pointed out, that was a really crucial moment of uptick in attention and just production in the United States especially. But what Tom and I found, and what we really emphasize in the book, is how much that U.S. gasohol boom of the 1970s was responding to the energy crisis of that era, of course, but also to what was happening in Brazil. Brazil really was several years, had started the transition to more widespread use of alcohol fuels a number of years prior to the United States. They really kind of pushed forward on alcohol fuels. And we find pretty direct evidence that, people in the United States involved in ethanol, the gasohol movement, were deeply aware of what was happening in Brazil. Some of them were traveling there. There was a lot of scientific and business networks being formed, many of which have continued to this day. And I think that's a really important part of the story of the gasohol boom that isn't emphasized as much, but really is central to understanding what happened in that era in the United States.
Interesting. So tell me more.
Well, the Brazilian federal government worked closely with private business people and the networks of associations of producers that linked sugarcane owners all around the country, but particularly in the state of Sao Paulo in the years immediately following 73, the first oil crisis. And it was simultaneously a response to the oil crisis and a response to yet another kind of renewed crisis within the sugarcane industry. And so these producers saw this opportunity with these spiking oil prices to seize the moment and find a solution, an exit out of their own crisis, while also serving the national interest. And so that was under the leadership of the president at the time was a general named Geisel. Brazil was at the time under a military dictatorship that lasted from 1964 to 1985. And one of the things that we argue is that the speed with which the Brazilian government established this program that ended up coming together in 1975 was due in part to the fact that they didn't have to worry about democratic processes like passing a bill through Congress and getting it signed. We're not the very first people to point this out, but we really do dig into these policy details to demonstrate that the move from an initial idea floated by a bunch of sugarcane businessmen to actually getting this program off the ground was very, very short. It was a short time. And so they acted with agility. And it really was this kind of public-private partnership, albeit it took the shape of something called the National Alcohol Program. In the Portuguese acronym is PROALCOL. And it incentivized a really rapid increase in production. It gave extremely low interest loans at a time when interest rates were fairly high, to incentivize production, mainly in this kind of heartland zone of sugarcane, which had migrated to the state of Sao Paulo, but then eventually really all over the country. it was responsible for pushing sugarcane agriculture into states that had no history with it. And that was partly because of this kind of federal largesse spreading out all of that funding.
And I'll just add to what Tom said, to say that, like I said, I think we find a lot of parallel histories, or histories where, the Brazilians move first and Americans are sort of watching and then trying to copy elements of it. But there are really important differences as well, and we try hard to delineate those in the book. As Tom said, politically, Brazil in the 1970s is very different as a military dictatorship than the United States, this big, messy democracy at the time. And also the structure of the oil industries in each country is very different. Brazil has a state-owned oil company in Petrobras. So when they make the move to embrace alcohol fuels, it's a matter of the military dictatorship going to the state-owned oil company and saying, you're going to do this now. Whereas in the United States, everything has to go through bills and, the kind of horse trading in Congress that has been central to this story. But even then, to get it to fuel pumps requires a lot of requires then negotiating with independent gas station owners, those gas stations that are vertically integrated with the oil companies, many of whom want nothing to do with alcohol fuels. So there are really important differences as well that we argue do shape fundamentally kind of the pathways that are possible for ethanol in both countries over time.
Well, I had the impression that the U.S. industry sort of bubbled up from frustrated farmers looking for something to do with their corn, not unlike what you described, Tom, about earlier with the sugarcane producers trying to find, what can we do with our sugar? We need an alternative product. Well, so for U.S. farmers, it was value added, but, a whole lot of the movement that we saw with all these ethanol plants across the Corn Belt was, a lot of them were farmer-raised, farmer-owned, initiated projects. And that would be very different. That would be a huge difference between the two, I would assume. Or do I not understand the whole picture?
No, I think that gets at an important element of it. And you're right that during that gasohol boom of the 1970s, there was just an enormous amount of interest in, farm scale stills operating, farmers who were mad about rising energy prices, wanted autonomy in the fuel system. This was an era, in the United States when we saw the American agricultural movement, all kinds of countercultural movements, of course, coming out of the 60s and the 1970s. As the famous, movie line from that era goes, like, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. So there was a lot of anger flowing around, and farmers certainly had an element of that as well. And many of them did sort of, turn towards farm level stills and things like that. But as we go forward in time, I do think, what you see is that a lot of those farm scale stills struggled quite a bit as you go forward into the 1980s, when the energy crisis dies off, oil prices come radically back down by the middle of the 1980s. A lot of farmers are dealing with, in the Midwest, of course, are dealing with the farm crisis of that era in the United States. And the pendulum for alcohol fuels kind of swings from that decentralized farmer-led movement towards one that's pretty dominated by agribusiness. In particular, Archer Daniels Midland Corporation has a real central role to play in the 1980s. And I think that pendulum swinging back and forth is one of the big dynamics we also see in the past half century or so of ethanol's history, the sort of the pendulum between, the dream of using alcohol fuels to get away from the petroleum system, which has been associated with monopoly in the U.S., all the way back to John D. Rockefeller. So, farmers can control their own destiny and their own fuels and get free from that system. But then the pendulum swings over to the reality that, you need to centralize. These are very, very low margin industries in many cases. It's only at massive scale that you can make a real go of it. And you see consolidation, and they sort of get big and get corporate. And then it swings back the other way. I think that pendulum has sort of defined the industry in the really big picture for several decades now.
Interesting, yeah. So what other, did the two countries sort of pay attention to what was going on in each other country and kind of feed policy back and forth, or what was going on and what happened?
Sure, they definitely did, and they knew each other. There were a lot of connections between politicians, for instance. We had the opportunity to speak to one of the former agriculture ministers of Brazil, the first ag minister for President Lula, who Lula's now back in office, of course, but he was also the president of Brazil from 2002 to 2010. And so this guy, Roberto Rodrigues, was the ag minister for that first term after 2002. And we had a fascinating conversation with him. He was there at the inception of the big program in 1975. He told us a hilarious story about early planning for it in the first months of really trying to chart out what would it mean, what kind of investment would the federal government have to make, and they were talking about the number of mules that they'd have to get involved, because it was before really they fully mechanized the process of getting cut cane from the field out to the carriers, and so it's still mule born in a lot of places around the country. So really just remarkable that only 50 years ago they're still talking about animal traction as opposed to more machines. But Rodrigues was just a really interesting figure for us because obviously from being there at the beginning in the 1970s to serving in the agriculture ministry, leading it, in fact, at the beginning of the 2000s, he witnessed several booms in the industry. And so he claimed to us, in fact, that he set off those major booms, that he was responsible for that, really the core of the policy in the 70s, and that he was the person who bent Lula's ear initially at the beginning of the 2000s and convinced him that this could be the hinge of diplomacy linking Brazil and the United States, the core of a relationship. And Lula and George W. Bush actually formed a pretty close, warm working relationship really around ethanol. They saw it as a mutual interest. They pursued the creation of a real international market in ethanol. That was their dream, that there would just be more ethanol produced around the entire world, with the United States and Brazil in leadership roles for the growth of such a market. It ended up not, in fact, that we know that didn't happen in the ways that they hoped it might, or it's going to be a slower burn getting there. But that's just one example of, all along the way, Rodrigues was familiar with and befriended U.S. politicians and people in the ethanol industry who would visit him in Sao Paulo, go back and forth. And so we saw lots of connections like that.
And if I could just jump back a little bit to the earlier moment coming out of the gasohol movement in the U.S. and the later days of pro-alcohol in Brazil, we saw lots, as Tom said, we saw lots of back and forth, a lot of connection, but also I was really struck by some interesting unintended consequences. Two that stand out to me, for example, is in the United States in 1980, so in the very waning days of the Carter presidency, they pass a bill that has a lot of tax incentives for the alcohol fuels industry, trying to really ramp up gasohol in 1980 as a response to that second energy crisis of the 1970s. And there's all kinds of other stuff of sort of alternative energies being floated at that time period, and a lot of federal money going into them. As part of those tax incentives, a number of Brazilian alcohol fuel makers look at what's happening in the U.S. and think, wow, we could make a lot of money. We could be competitive getting Brazilian ethanol into the U.S. markets now. So they do that, and imports of ethanol from Brazil all of a sudden take off right at this time period, much to the surprise and I think anger of a lot of the U.S. gasohol boosters who kind of had looked to the Brazilian model as an interesting model, but never really considered that like they would actually compete with what they imagined were going to be, Midwestern Corn Belt producers. And right away, there's a flurry of legislation in Congress to slap a tariff on the Brazilian ethanol coming in to protect the American producers. And some of those discussions I just found really interesting. You could tell like they hadn't really thought of, Brazil as an actual competitor in that market in a way that they would later get to know. But then the shoe's on the other foot a little bit later on, as you head later into the 1980s and into the 90s, Brazil's pro-alcohol program starts to struggle for a number of reasons. Some of them environmental, there's a series of bad harvests. Others, political and policy and economic. Brazil's economy is struggling with higher inflation rates in that time period, and the transition to democracy and neoliberalism is quite rough for many industries there. And there's a moment when Brazil has to actually start importing ethanol from the US just to get enough alcohol fuel to meet its own domestic needs, because they have all these all alcohol running cars, and they're calling up Archer Daniels Midland in Decatur, Illinois to arrange shipments of ethanol from the US into Brazil. So those moments we found really interesting, that they're both watching each other, but then there's some moments when it really becomes a kind of unintended consequence of the two countries moving on these interrelated pathways that are connected, but they haven't exactly figured out how to integrate them.
Interesting. So tell me that in the US it was E10, and I know that now the standard fuel in Brazil is E28 or E28, almost E30. But does that date back into this 80s and 90s too, where Brazil actually encouraged higher blending rates than the US, or were they the same?
I'm not sure if they've ever actually been the same blend at the same time. So yes, those things have been separated. The way it works in Brazil is that when you go to a filling station, you'll see pumps that say common gasoline or regular gasoline, gasoline comum, and you see pumps that have ethanol. But that so-called regular gasoline has been blended with ethanol since pretty much the beginning of that big program in the 70s. And it's just that the blend rate has changed and gone up over the 50 years. It's just been on an escalator tied to, of course, it's a policy of, that the state-owned oil company is told what to do. And the ethanol has always been there. And of course, they have their different price levels that the fuels are set at. And so every Brazilian driver has kind of in his or her head the point at which the discrepancy is such that they'll opt for one or another fuel. The gasoline, they're going to get to go a little bit further on a full tank. But it also tends to sell for, an increment higher than the ethanol. But yeah, those blend rates are not the same. I mean, they're certainly not pegged to each other in the two countries.
And I'll just follow up on that to clarify for U.S. listeners. That alcohol pump is pure alcohol in Brazil. And if you have a flex fuel vehicle, which most cars in Brazil are, I don't know the exact percent of the auto fleet there can run on flex fuel, they will fill up with either one or the other. The equivalent in the US, of course, is the E85 pumps. But the difference, I think one of the big differences, which we sort of alluded to, is just that the infrastructure to deliver those all ethanol pumps is really widespread in Brazil, whereas in the US, right, E85 pumps are not nearly as widespread. Certainly in the Corn Belt, you'll find quite a few gas stations where you can fill up with E85, but it's not a given that, if you're a driver in Florida or Arizona, that you're going to pull up to a gas station and see an E85 pump necessarily in the way you would in Brazil.
Okay. Well, and am I right that E100 actually is hydrous ethanol? It's not anhydrous as we have in the US?
That's right. Yes, that's right. And you were also right. I mean, just to confirm that you were right about the current blend rate is E30 for so-called regular gasoline in Brazil. It's been E30 for the past 3 months.
Oh, okay.
It was
Okay.
up from 27 and a half, I think, is what it was. It was set 27 and a half is what it was set at before August 1st. Fairly
Well,
confident of it.
yeah, I've done a little bit of stories about Brazil and about their automobile industry, and it's like all the same makes of automobiles that we have in the US are in Brazil, and they're all work just fine on either one of they're all flex fuel in Brazil.
They are all flex fuel, and in fact, that's something we tell the story of. The flex fuel revolution in the first decade of the 21st century was a big deal, and so we dedicate a good deal of space to that story. That's what set off the kind of the current, what we can think of as the extended current high time for ethanol production after the dip that Jeff had alluded to just a few minutes ago, when the big federal policy was suffering as a change of government, and a lack of support for it meant that producers weren't getting the same benefits. They were curtailing their production. Brazil seemed to be moving away from ethanol during the 1990s. And then it's the flex fuel engine. And really what it comes down to, as we learned, we spoke to a number of scientists, and here again, the connections between the United States and Brazil in the scientific study of engine technology, and particularly that fuel injection sensors, that those scientific networks cross the national boundaries very fluidly. And so we interviewed a guy who ran the federal lab in Brazil for this, and he said, "Oh yeah, I worked with EPA scientists all the time." They were sharing notes and everything, and it was a big advance to get this sensor that could, at great speed, determine the exact fuel mix being injected, and therefore introduce the precise amount of oxygen required to mix with it. And once that was mastered, flex fuel engines were everywhere, and it set off this renewed boom in ethanol production for Brazil.
And I'll just follow up to say the point that you made, Sue, of, hey, it's the same makes and models of cars for the most part, the same multinational automakers in the United States and Brazil, is something that people at the time had that same awareness. We talked to Boyden Gray, who was a high-level advisor, legal advisor under the Reagan administration, and then a close confidant and friend with George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush as president, and a real driver for promoting ethanol or alternative fuels under all those presidencies. And he told us that when traveling in Brazil, I believe it was in the 1980s in that case, when he was working for H.W. Bush's committee when H.W. Bush was vice president under Reagan. But he said, they had heard a lot from U.S. automakers and fuel companies to say, hey, we can't do this. It's too hard. It's going to cause all kinds of auto problems. It's such a headache. It's impossible. And he said, there he was in Brazil realizing, like, wait a second, these are all the same cars more or less, and they've done it in Brazil. So he said he brought back a real skepticism of those claims from automakers in the United States, and gave him sort of the confidence to push forward for more aggressive policies embracing biofuels, particularly ethanol, in the United States at that time period.
Interesting. Well, at one point I thought I heard where Reagan kind of reversed some of the policies that were beginning to flourish under his predecessor to support ethanol in that. But Boyden Gray was kind of in there trying to talk otherwise.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And at very early stages of this process, I was able to go out and do some research in the Reagan Library. You clearly see that Ronald Reagan's energy policy in its early years really was focused on essentially undoing a lot of the more ambitious energy policies that have been passed under the Carter administration and with the Congresses of that era. In part, they were very fortunate because the price squeeze of the 70s energy crisis has gone away and been replaced instead with kind of the energy glut of the 1980s. So what I found so interesting, though, and I think this speaks to a long-running trend in U.S. Ethanol policy, of course, is you get this battle between a conservative administration that wants a more free market approach under Reagan, saying, hey, get rid of all these subsidies, get rid of that stuff, just let the market sort this out, and a bipartisan group in Congress that mostly regionally based, centered in the Corn Belt, but with a few other outliers, that really sees, no, we really do want to keep encouraging biofuels, or what they then would have called alcohol fuels or ethanol, as support as part of agricultural policy, support for farmers, an important check on the oil industry in many cases, which at the time was primarily seen as being kind of foreign oil or imported oil into the United States. And so that was some of the dynamics, but they do switch over time. I mean, Boyden Gray is quite clear to say that as you head into the later Reagan administration, he is thinking about it. And in particular, George H.W. Bush is thinking hard about how could I use environmentalism to distinguish myself from Reagan? It's kind of hard for us to imagine today, of course, that, a Republican president really embracing the environmental movement as a conservative principle, but George H.W. Bush, I think, really thought of that as a possibility at the time period, and ethanol was an important part of that.
Fascinating. And what was going on in Brazil at this time?
In the 1980s?
Yeah.
The 80s and 90s. So part of this was redemocratization took place in 1985. The dictatorship had been real champions of ethanol production. And with redemocratization came some economic transformation as well. And as Jeff mentioned, part of that meant adopting more liberal policies, meaning freeing up some markets, getting rid of some of the state-owned enterprises, and trimming away some of those state supports to industries like the low-interest loans. And so that put, as I mentioned, also it kind of put the ethanol industry on a less sure footing. It was risky for all of those people who had bought what at that time were all alcohol cars because they didn't have the flex fuel engines. And so lots of consumers had invested in these cars that ran only on ethanol. And so there were a series of scares when it looked as though the nation would not be able to produce enough fuel even to keep those cars in the fleet running. That's when they had to turn to ADM and try to make kind of emergency shifts. And then in the 1990s, the whole sugarcane industry went through a period of consolidation that is directly parallel to the process that Jeff had described for the United States, with the kind of agribusiness interests taking over some of the smaller and more distributed businesses that had been producing ethanol. And it's that process of streamlining and consolidation that really drove prices down and helped make ethanol more viable again in the market. It's right as that was taking place that the flex fuel innovation happened. And so it was really two big processes working in tandem with each other that produced the modern ethanol industry in Brazil.
Okay. And so now the sugar industry in Brazil is pretty consolidated. Whereas the last time I give a history talk at the Fuel Ethanol Workshop, and I kind of went through the group, and about half of the U.S. industry is still kind of farmer community owned, and about half of it is more of a corporate structure. Not purely, but roughly that. Am I right on that? And how do you see that all evolving?
Yeah, I think that's generally right. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me either, but I would say in the U.S. case, two big things are shaping those dynamics that you talk about, Sue, in terms of more kind of agribusiness dominated or farmer owned. And the first of these is that I think those are actually quite that's a muddy boundary in the history of United States agriculture and agribusiness in particular, where lots of the farmer co-ops that come out of the early 20th century, by the middle and late 20th century, they're acting in ways that are pretty similar to businesses.
Yeah.
Like the dividing line between an agribusiness corporation like a Cargill or an ADM and one of the big, more business-minded co-ops is, can be hard to tell the difference in some ways.
Yes.
But the second thing that really drives that in particular was this brings us forward to the U.S. ethanol boom of the 2000s, when there is sort of this new enormous boom period. This is really what sets the pace for the modern U.S. ethanol industry, arranged mostly around these dry grind corn ethanol mills that sprout up all over the place during the 2000s, both before and especially after the renewable fuel standards are passed. The first one in 2005, the much more expansive one in 2007. And lots of those are built by cooperatives or small groups of farmers who pool their capital together because they're very interested in these as money-making opportunities. They're interested in having more, better markets for their harvests that are close by, alternatives to the local elevator, things like that. And that sees a huge explosion of ethanol producers outside those traditional that small handful of agribusinesses that had dominated the markets in the previous decade.
Right, right. So a big part of that explosion in the boom was caused by the banning of MTBE and sort of a whole clean fuels. The 70s and 80s were energy security, I think. Probably other messages as well. Oh, and something, how to deal with the farm problem, how to use these surplus grains, and that would be probably parallel in both countries. And then you have the Clean Air Act and the need for clean fuels, and the benefit of using a lot of ethanol to get a cleaner burning fuel. Does that also parallel in both countries?
There is a parallel, yeah. That's a good. You've hit some excellent high points there for what was motivating changes in the industries, and there are versions of that very similar kind of a sequence in Brazil too. And so there's also a push for cleaning up the air. Huge metropolises like São Paulo, the valley that São Paulo's in. So the whole metro area has 24 million people. It's a gigantic city, and it's kind of the poster city for urban pollution, or it became that in the 70s. And so there were, starting in the 70s and 80s, there was an environmental push for cleaner fuels and reining in the transportation pollution in general. And so that runs in parallel. Similar, like a pattern of legislation that parallels the United States in a lot of ways. And you're right about also that the question of energy security and sovereignty too. We want to control our own energy production. Very similar kinds of debates that were going on at the time. Lots of negative depictions of the Middle East in as we discuss some of these things. And to kind of, especially by producers to generate more support for their homegrown fuels. So yes, I mean, in a lot of ways, as Jeff pointed out, there are definitely distinctions. These are quite different countries. And so because of the differences that we know from the outset, it's really the similarities that drew our attention and became surprising as they proliferated across the project. And that includes things like the pace of the environmental movement, the pace of adopting legislation. We got to talk to one of the real leaders of that movement. He was a former federal deputy, which is the lower house of Congress in Brazil. Instead of the House of Representatives, it's called the House of Deputies. He was a former deputy, and he was one of the key authors of all of the environmental provisions in the new constitution that Brazil adopted in 1988. So he's still kind of granted the credit for introducing all of these environmental provisions into the actual national constitution. And he was concerned about urban pollution and emissions. And he told it, he told us that story. So yes, there are direct parallels, including even close kind of timing.
Yeah, and we really track, I think, there's sort of like a double-edged sword with the pollution questions that pop up in the late 20th century. On the one hand, growing evidence of particularly air pollution from auto exhausts in Brazil and the United States, and of course around the world, is sort of raising awareness of the ecological cost of auto dependency in both countries. Burning so much, gasoline out of our tailpipes just comes with an enormous sort of pollution cost. And this is when the sort of, like as you said, the rationale for ethanol really starts to shift fully from seeing it as a tool for energy security, or as I like the phrase that they used in the 70s, hamburger helper for the gasoline supply, to a more environmental. This is the way to clean the tailpipes, for clean air, things like that. So that's on the one hand, and this becomes, sort of the central argument for a lot of ethanol going from the 1990s onward. But the other side of it is that as the ethanol industry expands in both countries, they do have to deal with the fact that, producing ethanol causes pollution as well, in a variety of ways. In Brazil, this plays out through a lot of water pollution from those sugarcane mills. It produces a polluting substance that, initially is dumped into rivers and things like that. And there's sort of grassroots movements in these sugarcane producing areas against the water pollution. In the United States, we haven't seen quite as much of that, although there certainly are debates about, nitrate pollution in the waterways in the Corn Belt and places like Iowa and things like that. But also then broader questions of, it becomes a question of how do you weigh the environmental benefits versus the environmental costs of it. It becomes sort of a tricky calculus, I think, that biofuels starts to face really from the 1990s onward.
Yeah, yeah. So as we come to an end of our time here on the podcast, the title of your book, Ethanol, A Hemispheric History for the Future of Biofuels. For the future of biofuels, tell me a bit about what you were thinking or what you're talking about there.
I think it's partly an exhortation that any future for biofuels needs to take account of its past. And so here's a history for the future of the future of planning, the future of organization of this broad industry. We think that there are important kinds of patterns that we've seen over the course of this long history. One of the ones that we've emphasized repeatedly in this conversation today has to do with this transnational aspect of it, that this is not something that really has played out in one country alone. And Brazil and the United States together produce, of course, the vast majority of all of ethanol production around the world. And so it's really a transnational story. But it's also a story that has shown repeated moments of tight integration between policy making and changes in the industry. And maybe that's not the most surprising thing in the world, but it becomes more visible in a sense when you have both of the countries in your perspective. And so once you've taken the transnational perspective, you can clarify just how closely linked is the industry to certain kinds of policy tools in the respective countries.
Yeah, and I'll add, Tom, I think, has spoken really eloquently to the kind of the transnational piece we're trying to draw people's attention to. I think especially we hope U.S. readers, I know many people are deeply aware of this, a lot, we talk in the book how, commodity growers in the United States, they're aware that they exist on global markets these days. They're reading the Wall Street Journal and keeping an eye on the weather, just to remind people that, that's been the case for a long time when we think about biofuels. And, as historians, we're always hesitant to predict the future. But I think certainly when you look at more recent history in biofuels, a lot of the attention has shifted not just to what's happening in Washington, D.C. or Corn Belt state capitals, but to South America and increasingly to South Asia, right? What's going on in India, what's going on in Malaysia, places like that. So it seems to me the future, it's not hard to foresee a future that's even more global for this industry than what the past has been. And I'll also add for the history piece, I think we want to draw readers' attention to. I think sometimes our discussions about ethanol start from the idea that, it's a new fuel that, we're in the cusp of trying out for people who are advocates, and they say, hey, if we get more support, we can really kind of make a go of this thing. Or for critics, they say, hey, we tried it and it didn't work. It was a problem, it was a disaster, whatever. And we kind of argue, I don't think either of those are a useful way of thinking about the history of ethanol as a fuel. It's a very old fuel that has had moments and sort of cycles to its history, and its future, it certainly is going to have a future. This is a fuel that in many ways predates the use of petroleum as a fuel. If you go back into the early 19th century. So it's unlikely that it's going away anytime soon, but I think people who are in the industry or just follow it closely would do well to think hard about those patterns that its history has had, because I suspect we'll continue to see more of those patterns in its future.
Interesting. So, Jeff, when you contacted me a while back, and I learned about your book and said you ought to be on the podcast, you said that you learned some things from some of the interviews we've done, some of the guests we've had on this podcast. Can you? And I need to find more people willing to talk. I discovered summertime is not a good time to recruit people to talk about this because they're way too busy. So I'm hoping I can, this is the beginning of another round of conversations with people. But what did you learn from some of those earlier things that either surprised you or you didn't know?
I think one thing I've really enjoyed in listening to the previous episodes has been just the variety of that grassroots gasohol movement in the U.S. in the 1970s. Sue, I think some of your guests have spoken really eloquently to that. And I will say, as a historian, the stories that I get are oftentimes, they come to us mostly from archives, right? From documents that are left in archives. And those are great. But they're only one way to understand the part of the past. I really enjoyed hearing some of the guests that you've had speaking to that. And I think also some of the variety of, people involved in wheat farmers in eastern Montana and places like that, who, we don't think of as maybe central to the story of ethanol as it evolves into the 2000s, where it's more of a Corn Belt story and things like that. So I think just expanding a little bit of my understanding, I'm always, perennially surprised by the kind of enormous variety of U.S. agriculture and the different interests in different regions and things like that. It's something I always enjoy learning about. And I will say, the nice thing maybe about talking to both academics and farmers is that we're on opposite seasonal cycles, right? We, as academics, we plant in the fall with a new crop of students and we harvest in the spring when they graduate. So I don't know, maybe in the summer you should reach out to professors.
Okay, that's a good point. Great. Well, I thank you both for taking the time to visit with me, and I'm hoping that the listeners to the Homegrown Fuels podcast will be as intrigued by all this as I've been. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.
Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbiinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels at bbiinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarsky, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.